You're reading a 400-page manuscript. This is your job. But when, 200 pages in, a bunch of clowns mysteriously show up, the plot goes off the rails. It's your job to fix this manuscript. You're an agent, or an editor, or friend of the writer. But using today's tools, Microsoft Word or Google Docs, you spend half your time fighting the software. You don't want mail merge or check grammar or even edit the manuscript. The keyboard keeps showing up and you lose your place in the manuscript. Enter Marginalist, an app for agents, editors, professors, writers, or any reader of long-form text. Marginalist lets you import Word documents, read them with the utmost grace, leave comments effortlessly, and then export right back to Word. Marginalist is free to download for Apple devices at the App Store. Or even better, get the first 6 months of the Pro version free by going to marginalist.app/covers. Today's episode is unusual both for me and today's guest, one of Oregon's most renowned painters, Stephen Hayes. Stephen reached out to me to invite me to see his most recent paintings in his workspace, in his studio, because one of the 12 abstract paintings in a series called Elegy, engaging with the genocide in Gaza, was created while listening to my conversation with Omar El Akkad and to the audiobook of Omar's book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. Shortly after this visit, this peek behind the curtain of a visual artist's process and method, Stephen asked if I would be in public conversation with him at the gallery as part of this exhibition. He wanted to do something different, to be in conversation about these works, not with a fellow painter or an art curator like he usually does, but in this case, a literary podcaster who had helped create the atmosphere through which one of these paintings came into being. I had to trust that he knew what he was asking, what he wanted, that he knew what he would get and what he wouldn't get, as I wouldn't be able to talk in depth from a deep well of knowledge about his work in relation to the history of art or about technique in the same way a fellow painter would be able to. I had to trust that perhaps I could bring something else, that together, both of us stepping into an unfamiliar space, we could create something new. I think of years ago now when the poet and visual artist Jen Bervin reached out to tell me she was, if I remember correctly, sewing silver sequins for River, her amazing large-scale sculptural installation of the Mississippi River, that itself was made to scale, each inch of the sculpture corresponding to a mile of the river, that she was sewing this while listening to my conversation with Lele Long Soldier. At the time, and still now, my response was to marvel at it, to be full of wonder and awe and gratitude at the mystery that the show would find itself in an artist's studio in this way. But I knew that I needed to bring more than a wow or a whoa or a no way to my conversation with Stephen. And I want to thank poet and visual artist Daniela Naomi Molnar for thinking alongside me, and also Pass Between the Govers guest Melanie Ray Tone, whose sister Wendy Tone is a visual artist, who also helped me think through some possible approaches. But mainly what I did was look to past conversations on the show with poets, as these conversations are usually the place where visual art comes up most on the show. And imagining that we might have some new listeners for this conversation, perhaps more painters than usual, I wanted to highlight some of these conversations in case you find yourself craving to know what to listen to next. The two conversations on the show where the guests were as known or more known for their visual art were with Jen Bervin and with Cecilia Vicuña. But among the poets who are mainly poets, the first conversation with Jory Graham about her book Runaway is a must because of her remarkable discussion of using the painter's plein air techniques with her poetry students, but also the conversation with Amma Kojo, which touches on everyone from Simone Lee to Lorraine O'Grady, and Dion Brand and Kinesia Lubrin engaging with the work of Torkwasi Dyson, just to name a few. I think of poetry when I think of Stephen working against the image, against figuration in his latest work. And much of today's conversation arises from a question that I have: what it does and doesn't mean to make abstract art about an urgent, still unfolding political crisis. Stephen explicitly bridges this gap himself many times when he describes, as one example, the role of silence in these pieces amidst an atmosphere of people being silent or being silenced. But I suspect you'll make connections too, to Gaza, as we stay close to process and method, even when he doesn't explicitly make these connections. For instance, when he says that every time an image of a landscape showed up, he found himself scraping it off, wiping it out, pushing the paint around where he would not let it arrive. I found myself thinking of the moonscape of utter destruction Gaza has become. It also makes me think of lines from Jory Graham's poem, Pollock and Canvas, a poem that lives in the gap between Jackson Pollock's brush and his canvases, a gap that never closes, where she says, "Where does the end begin? Where does the lifting off of hands become love? Letting the maid wade out into danger, letting the form slur out into flaw, inconclusiveness." And in Stephen's discussion of captions, I think of the last episode with the poet Robin Coss Lewis, whose first book refuses us images too, and engages with the titles of paintings across history in relation to the Black figure in art, where she says, if we considered an art title the true portrait, the hidden image, what would you see? If we refused to look at the painting, could we perceive more of the art? For prose writers listening, who, like me, might feel unmoored by the terms of this discussion, I want to argue that Stephen's work against figuration shares a lot in common with many prose writers on the show too. I think of past guest Vajra Chandrasekhara in his acceptance speech for this year's Ursula K. Le Guin Prize for Fiction, saying there is nothing inherently liberatory about the imagination, and using one of the founding texts of political Zionism, a science fiction novel by Theodore Herzl, as an example. One way to engage with this fact of the imagination, that it isn't inherently good or bad and can be used for both, is, to borrow a phrase from Adrienne Marie Brown, to engage in an imagination battle. That if you don't imagine the future you want, you will live in a world imagined by others. But another is to work against narrative, to make visible its construction as you write it, a sensibility that I think shares some of the qualities with Stephen's approach, that the fictive spell and the image share an allure that some of our most interesting artists and thinkers are, if not working against it, making it visible and interrogating it. This conversation happened on a rainy Saturday, November morning at the Elizabeth Leach Gallery in front of a standing room only crowd. I'll share a link to the exhibition in the show notes, and in the supporter resource email, I will share some links to specific paintings that we discuss alongside resources about Stephen and his work more generally. If you're interested to learn more about the benefits and rewards of joining the Between the Covers community, you can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Two last things before we begin. Daniel Peabody, the gallery director, introduces us, but then about 6 or 7 minutes into the Q&A at the end, he asks a question himself about the other part of Stephen's exhibition that we don't discuss, called Wild Beauty. And Stephen's answer about his awakening of consciousness around landscape painting, something he's been doing for 45 years, is incredibly illuminating, and I think it deepens the conversation that we had even more. So be sure to keep listening and hear that exchange. Lastly, the recording device at the gallery shuts off every 30 minutes, so there's maybe a 15 or 20-second section of the interview where I fill a gap with the recording from an iPhone sitting between us. That's why you will hear a sudden, if brief, change in sound quality. Okay, without further ado, here is today's conversation, the painter Stephen Hayes.
We're here to celebrate the show, or celebrate or honor, whatever the right word is, this exhibition of Stephen Hayes' work. I've been here at the gallery 20 years, and so I've had the privilege of working with Stephen for 20 years, but Stephen has actually been showing with the gallery since 1986. So I don't know what this is, almost 40 years, or maybe it's, almost 40 years, because the gallery's approaching its 45th anniversary. This is his 24th solo show with the gallery in that time. So we have had the opportunity, as have been, yes, please. So many of us have had the opportunity to see many of his exhibitions, which is a real pleasure. As myself and many of you know, he is really well known both regionally and nationally for his abstracted landscapes, which I like to describe as capturing the essence of a place rather than exactly what it looks like. And as you can see looking around, what we're standing in is a bit different than that. And I think if you've been following his work for those 40 years, or 20 or whatever you've been following, you have seen him reinvent his creative practice on a number of occasions. This is not the first time he has reinvented his practice in some way. And I think that takes a real bravery and trust in your creative endeavors to do that. And so we're really proud to be showing a body of work that is very much in line with what I have seen from Stephen Hayes before, but different in a few essential ways. And that is something that I'm really proud to present, because I think it just shows that he's an artist who consistently demonstrates bravery in his practice. These paintings are somewhat similar in the sense that they are about the essence of something, but I think these are about the essence of emotion rather than the essence of a place. And so that is a bit different, but he will speak to that. You're here to hear them talk about it and not me. So joining Stephen today is David Naiman, who is a literary podcaster, among many other things. His podcast is called Between the Covers. It is done by Tin House Media here in Portland, but it has been promoted far wider by media like The Guardian and BuzzFeed. I believe they can speak to this maybe better than I, but I believe their conversation, Stephen and David's conversation, began after a podcast on the book One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This by Omar El Akkad, and who's, I believe, a Portland author. And I heard that podcast and a number of others. And one of the things that David does that's so beautiful is he does a very long-form literary interview. And so we're very excited to hear his take on visual art. But I think the subject matter that began the conversation is so pertinent to this exhibition. They are a perfect pairing for this conversation. So if you'll join me in welcoming them, we'll just turn it over to them.
Well, first, I just want to thank the Elizabeth Leach Gallery and also Stephen. In the spirit of looking at how he reinvents his work over time, he said he wanted to do something different with his painting conversation around the exhibition than he usually does. And I imagine, not knowing, that usually he's probably with an art curator or with a painter peer rather than a literary podcaster. So we both sort of put ourselves in a situation that's new and unfamiliar to both of us in a sense. I'm normally talking to writers. Some of them occasionally are visual artists, and we talk about visual art, but we're usually talking about the visual art through language. So like my naive question when he first asked me, and I felt this sense of excitement and honor, but also fear and anxiety, was...
Goes both ways.
My naive question was going to be, which has sort of been the umbrella under which I've been thinking about a line of inquiry, what does it mean to make abstract art during an ongoing, urgent, unfolding political event that is engaging with it? But instead of asking that to start out with, I thought what we could do is start with what I imagine is the atmosphere or the climate of Stephen painting and how that atmosphere influenced choices he made in making the paintings. I mean, we all know that right now there's a lot of pressure on free speech, the stigmatization of certain types of speech. For instance, the journalists at the Washington Post who lost their job because of not mourning Charlie Kirk the right way. But it's particularly focused on Palestinian speech. We've seen tenured professors lose their jobs. We've seen student visas being revoked, people being deported. But that's only new in the sense that it's in the news now. It's actually been going on for decades. The Palestine Legal estimates there were 1,700 what they call suppression events between 2014 and 2020, which are events being canceled or reputations of people teaching certain things being tarnished. And I imagine Stephen working in this climate or breaking silence around this climate. And I know in a little bit we've talked about it. He talked about preparing the ground of the canvas in this climate and choices that were made based on the atmosphere. And I'd love, and I don't know how many people here would share this, to know more about preparing the ground of a canvas, just generally speaking, what are the choices that you do? And then what are the specific choices, given what the state of the world and what you're wanting to engage in it, that were made because of what's going on outside of the studio?
Well, thank you for asking right away one of the harder ones. I appreciate it. So, that's a multifaceted question that I'm getting from David. If I stick with just the most obvious, it is the physical preparation of materials and the collection of materials. And for those of you who are painters or makers of things, you probably relate, hopefully you relate to the decision that needs to be made at the outset. What scale am I going to work on? Am I going to make everything myself, or am I going to purchase pre-made things? How much am I going to rely on being in the process, and how important is the process to ultimately the end result? So for me, the process is always integral and integrated into the meaning of the work. And often I begin making work not knowing exactly what is going to happen with that work, but I have to make a decision about scale and proportion. So in this particular body of work, I didn't start off knowing what I was making when I made these works, but I knew I wanted to work on this scale and in these proportions. So I built the stretchers, the strainers, I stretched the canvas, I primed the canvases. And in talking with David about this, I didn't realize it at the time, but I realized that I did all of that in total silence this time. And that's not normal for me. That's not common for me. It's more common to have music blaring and, be just enjoying the process and getting kind of lost in it. But I didn't do that for whatever reason. I didn't know what was going to happen with those. First, I made 6 canvases just because I work in a small studio that's about a quarter the size of this room. That's about the max I could ever have on the walls. Actually, I couldn't have all 6 up at the same time. Ultimately, one day I went into work and I thought I knew what I was going to do. And as soon as I started putting paint on the canvas, I realized that every time an image showed up, so you mentioned that, or Daniel mentioned that, landscape seems to be a thing that people know that I have done for a long time. Every time an image of landscape started to show up, I just scraped it off and wiped it out and pushed the paint around and got rid of it and would not let it arrive, would not let an image land. So I went from canvas to canvas that way, just sort of pushing paint around and responding with a destructive force, my destructive force of imagery every time it tried to show up. And in retrospect, of course, I think I know what I was doing was I was not finding the easy way in. Again, I didn't know that this was the work I was moving toward, but I knew that this is not the time to be in a place of comfort. That's kind of what happened internally. So not a time to be in a place of habit, not a time to be in a place of comfort, not a time to think you know what the fuck you're doing. Just admit that we're in new territory. And a few months, I went through that, and then I realized, this is a body of work that's happening because what's happening internally in my response to what's happening in the world, specifically what's happening in Gaza. I came to recognize that these were about what is happening there. They weren't about specific incidents, like this particular day or that particular event, but the general sense of, first of all, horror, confusion, sense of complicity, being, paying your estimated taxes and thinking like, no, I want this to go towards food, right? We all have to come to some kind of internal place with our reconciliation. Are we being complicit? Are we doing something about this? Are we being heard? So once I realized what I was doing here, and I knew this had to be a larger body of work. Plus, I had a scheduled show up. I thought this show was going to be some beautiful landscape paintings, So I went and built 6 more canvases and stretched 6 more canvases so that I could engage with a dozen canvases. And the number 12 turned out to be an important number in that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm going to let David ask another question.
Well, I remember, and this is going to show like my limitations of the right lexicon in talking about visual art. But I remember when we were having coffee, you talking about even choices before you start painting around preparing the canvas, like smooth versus rough, and how that the choices you made there had to do with acknowledging entering a fraught space with your work.
So again, if you're a painter and you know about preparing things, it does matter the surface that you work on. Like I work on canvas, but I stretch it over board so that it's a really resistant surface. It doesn't bounce back and forth. It doesn't feel too fragile. And then the canvas needs to be protected with a gesso, to both provide a kind of brilliance of color, letting light travel through paint and reflect that color, but also to protect the canvas from erosion and the deleterious effects of oils. When David and I met for coffee, we only met once prior to this. We don't have anything, I don't know what he's going to be asking me about. But one of the things we did talk about was it did seem important to me at the time to make sure that these canvases had multiple 3 or 4 coats of gesso on them with sand in between so that they were really this kind of pure surface, and that the surface wasn't resistant, the surface wasn't imparting texture by itself, that they just were fully protected and fully virginal in a way. And again, it's not always the case when I prepare canvases for making paintings, but for some reason this time it seemed really clear that I needed to do that, not in a conscious way, and so I did that. Mm-hmm. So all of these have a slightly different kind of ground than I'm used to working on. It allows the paint to move around really quickly. When you do it that way, if you do 1 coat, it's a really resistant thing. If you do 2 coats, it's a little bit less resistant. If you do 3 or 4 coats and sanding in between, it's a more skaters are going on there, and for some reason that seems necessary.
Well, the painting behind us is probably the main reason I'm sitting in this chair today, which 11 of the paintings were done in silence. And this painting, the one that's white, was done while listening to me in conversation with Omar El Akkad, I think also with Isabella Hamad, and with Omar El Akkad's audiobook.
Yes.
And it also, I believe, has the most symbolic, connotative underpainting of the 12 paintings, I suspect.
It's the only deliberate painting, actually. None of these are deliberately made to look the way they look. All of them, except for this one, were made literally by just starting to paint, resisting imagery, covering things up, painting more, resisting imagery, covering things up. I mean, I think about all painting as abstract painting. Even the paintings that I make that have imagery in them, they're not the place, right? They're not the thing or the person. They're a simulacrum at best and a representation, or they make you think of, but they're an abstraction. And so these don't surprise me that imagery would disappear in this case. Imagery is not, for me, imagery is not my friend in these paintings. So I want to avoid that. But this painting began, as David said, it's the only one that I actually listened to anything, and it was his podcast, his interview with Omar El Akkad, and also listening to Omar's book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. And it occurred to me that I needed to have structure for this painting to become the painting it was going to become. So I gridded off the canvas. It's a 60-inch by 60-inch painting. I gridded off the canvas into 3-inch squares. So there was a 20 by 20 unit, 400 cell grid on the canvas. And without hesitating in making it, I just mixed up a bunch of black paint. Actually, it's kind of olive green and black and a bunch of different things in there, but it's black paint and a little brush about a size 2, about a 1/4-inch brush. And in the first cell in the upper left-hand corner, started making marks with the intention of making 100 marks in that little square. And then each one filled out so that the whole canvas would be covered with a black mark to the tune of 40,000 black marks. And every mark that was put down, I said it out loud. I didn't say names or anything like that, but it was like 1, 2, 3, 4, like this in a process, going almost into a trance, almost into a meditation. And it took quite a long time to cover that canvas with 40,000 black marks. And before I got to the end of covering that canvas, I realized that wasn't going to be enough. So I put another 50 marks in each cell, so to the tune of 60,000 black marks. Again, counting 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course, very conscious of news reports of, this many are now killed, this many are now, So it finally, got filled up. It's one of the few times that I've actually ever cried in my studio. I had the thought, I'm just going to mix up a bunch of white paint and whitewash this out. I'm just going to cover this up, make a shroud for it, wipe it all out, wash it out. And I resisted that urge and decided to make another 60,000 white marks on top of that. So I just regridded the canvas so that I could see where I was. I could orient myself. And you notice there's no horizon in any of these. There's no orientation in any of these. You can't find where you are in any of these. There's not sky and land. There's not footing, And so on this one, I needed to artificially impose footing, a way to find myself. And again, 1, 2, 3, so that each one of those black marks then had its own white mark. And you can make of that what you will. But it wasn't the easy choice. It wasn't it would be easy to mix up a gallon of white paint and just paint it all over. It was the necessary process of you get this one, you get this one, you get this one, you get this one.
Well, my entryway, or the way that I found my way into thinking about visual art, is through poetry. I was happy that poetry's in the description. Poetry, prayer, and a placard were all connected to the Elegy description. But I think about a long-standing affinity between poetry and visual art. A lot of poets who come on the show are engaging in some relation with visual art. Some of them are visual artists, but they're coming on as poets, like Cecilia Vicuña or Jen Bervin. But there's also this sense of working against the connotative aspect of language. So foregrounding the visual of words on the page, but also the sonic qualities. So for instance, Robert Frost would talk about when you hear people on the other side of a wall and you can't make out any of the words, but you hear all the intonations, the volume, a sense of gesture, that's where the meaning is. And Virginia Woolf also had this phrase, the wave in the mind, and the words would come and fit into the wave, and that it's actually the wave, not the words, that is where the meaning is. And so it's a foregrounding of a materiality of language, but also sort of working against something that we assume is the main focus of language. And I wanted to use that, I guess, as a frame to asking you some questions about how you work with or against materials also and representation. Because I found this quote, I'm sure it's well known, by de Kooning. What does painterly mean? And then he says, answering himself, that you can see it's done with a brush. And then on your website, landscape is inescapably political. It can also be achingly beautiful. I find working with this imagery is the best way for me to engage with the material of paint and the ongoing complexity of human history as it pertains to the land. And when PBS did their profile of you, you talk about how you're trying not to hide how the paintings are being made so that intentionally we see the construction of the paintings as we view the final product of the paintings, the brush strokes and the scrapes. And I wondered if you could bring that into the Elegy exhibition for us.
Absolutely. If you're a painter, you know that painting is one of the most seductive actions that you can do, in terms of making. It's immediately just sensual. I've been painting a long time, 45 years now, and it has always been the case that with all the work that I make, even if it contains images, the engagement with the materials has been the way the images have been arrived at. And the engagement with the materials lasts a long time. That part lasts a long time. Anytime that I've had an image in mind that I wanted to arrive at, it's usually not been successful to think ahead of time, this is the picture I want to make, and I'll use these materials to do that. Usually the way it works when things are successful, this is the arena in which I want to operate. This is the language that I want to speak in that arena, and I'm going to trust that this process will take me somewhere over there, and I'll recognize, even if I don't get where I thought I wanted to go, I'll recognize that I'm where I'm supposed to go. It's like that. So there's a lot of unknown in that way of working. I find anytime that I try and know too much, I'm not very successful in the end result. People might think, they might like the end result in that regard on some level, but it doesn't satisfy me. It's like the difference between illustrating an idea and illuminating an idea. If you can really fix things in place that explains everything in an illustrative way, you get the message across, but you don't necessarily feel the weight of it, But if you can illuminate that thought, if you can get people, if you can get yourself, I guess I do it for myself, not for you. If I can get myself into that place where the thing has been illuminated, then that's all I want to hope for. That's, I'm doing well.
Yeah. Well, maybe to extend this question of illustration versus illumination, the description around Elegy, I just want to read a couple sentences. A painting like a poem will point you in the direction of the thing that needs to be seen. A placard like a prayer demands our attention. Yesterday like tomorrow, but most urgently today is the time for open eyes and action. The squares in this cycle act singly and collectively as poem, placard, prayer. And I'm interested in this line that a painting like a poem will point you in the direction of the thing that needs to be seen, because in a way it feels like your work historically could be viewed as looking away from a perceived image that would then suggest that maybe what needs to be seen isn't by the eye. I'm not sure. But I'm going to read a couple things from past and ask you maybe to think with me about what it means that a painting points you to what needs to be seen. Because in your work 20 years ago, Terra Incognita, you're shooting slides out the window of your car, often not looking at what you're photographing, and then later video, and then manipulating the video before you do the painting. And in one review of that work, Terry M. Hopkins said, it was a way to see what is missed, what is on the periphery of our vision and our consciousness. The slides were an attempt to capture a landscape we are aware of without seeing or know without looking. And then more recently, in the hour before, you're using Google Earth and you're going to places where there were acts of violence, Ferguson or the Bataclan terrorist attack in Paris. But the Google Earth's just showing you a very quotidian street corner. And so the dissonance comes when you look at the caption, not when you look at the painting. You're both looking away by showing the before or the after, which looks totally normal. But you also have to look away from the painting to see what you were looking at when you looked at the painting. And I wanted to hear more about maybe this relates to illumination, that something is illuminated, but it's perhaps not illuminated through perception.
Well, yeah, that's exactly the case, and even the strategy. I mean, I hate to use that word, but it's a strategic way of asking the viewer themselves to be the one that assigns the significance here. So, like, say, I don't know if you saw the show, I don't know how many shows ago it was. There's a big painting on this wall here, Parkland, Florida. And the title of the painting was Parkland, Florida, February 14th, 2018. And if you were living under a rock, you wouldn't know. First of all, you wouldn't recognize Parkland, Florida. The name wouldn't mean anything to you, except if you just came in and saw the painting, you might say, wow, that's a really big painting, and that's kind of beautiful. And it's and get lost in moving the paint around. And, it was a really beautiful painting, if I do say so myself. And it was a big painting, and you could just walk right into it. And when you read the title, if you were available to think about it, the title would let you know that you were looking at the site of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, and that painting, I made it like within 6 months of that event. You would have realized that this painting is connected to the murder of 22 high school kids, and you might have thought, oh, I don't like this painting anymore. It's not a beautiful painting. This is a horrific, you know what I mean? So the painting didn't change. The title didn't change. What changed was one's willingness to enter into that space, to engage with it. And it's not dissimilar from this. I'm not telling you what to think about any of this. I'm not even telling you if I think there's a right or a wrong side in this, in what's going on here. But I am asking that you recognize that your openness is the thing that assigns the meaning and assigns the connection and allows maybe for a slowing down to think about it. We're so responsive. We're all in such response and so defended that on some level, if you just recognize that on an individual, one person at a time, on an individual basis, if you were able to slow down and really take this in, there might be a crack and a movement forward.
Well, in the hour before with Google Earth, I also read that you used images that were black and white, and that then you either had to recall the colors or imagine colors that you wanted to be in the black and white. And it made me wonder, particularly in the 11 paintings that were done in silence, if there's something you hold in your mind's eye, the way you might conjure something, or whether even eye is the right organ of to even be thinking of.
Yeah, zero, nothing in the thinking, no image, no particular event being just chewed over in the process. It literally is each painting asked me to engage with it. It sounds really woo-woo, when you talk about it like that, but each painting asked me to engage with it in an earnest and loving way, be with me and allow me to become, this really sounds weird. But it's like a channeling, and it's not how I normally think of the way that I work, but that insistence of leaving behind imagery, that wasn't me thinking, oh, I've got an idea, I'm going to leave behind imagery. That was not the case. It was as if, like, when it shows up, do not allow it in, because there is no way to know where you are in this, Daniel picked up on that, made the comment that, these look just like your paintings, but there's no horizon line, and somebody else, who was it, Judy's here, Cook made the comment once that each successive body of work over time, the horizon's starting slowly disappearing, going one way or the other, until finally there's nothing here. There's no footing. There's no way to know where you are in there. But if you're in a frame of mind to enter the space of the painting, you're in it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned to me when we were having coffee that you also had a constraint that you could only use the materials that were on hand.
Yeah.
And I don't know how unusual that is. So maybe you could tell us, is that a very unusual technique? But also, why was that a constraint that came to mind for you, that you would only paint with materials that were there?
You're going to love this. It's totally practical. Like, this year hasn't been great for sales of work, so I don't have a lot of money to buy new materials. So I've got a stockpile of paint here. I'm going to use this paint. I mean, I did replenish a few colors once I knew I needed more volume of that color, but a lot of it was totally practical. And everybody in here who's an artist knows that thing where I have this size canvas, I have these pencils, whatever the materials are, so that's what I'm going to use.
To maybe talk a little bit more about abstraction versus figuration, let's spend a moment with color. This is what it says on the Elizabeth Leach website about Elegy. In all of his paintings, color is paramount, and certainly in these works, as it is color that is asked to convey the soul of each artwork. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to how you're engaging with color. It seems to me like an impossible question, but maybe we could walk around in that question a little bit about color.
Well, let me ask you to identify a particular painting that color confuses you. And
that confuses me?
Yeah, or engages you, or attracts you, or repels you.
Yeah. The one I feel most rejected by is the lime green one.
Okay.
I don't have a dislike. I feel pushed out of the painting, let's say.
Okay.
With that painting.
So this painting, the title of which is Hamsa, which means 5 in Arabic. And by the way, I don't think we've mentioned it, but the titles of the paintings are just numbers, 1, 2, 3 through 12. But I've named them in the Arabic language. Partly it's a poetic sound when you say it out loud. It's beautiful to hear. Partly it's a really dehumanizing way of identifying something. There's nothing poetic about the fact that these are the numbers 1 through 12, But then it is important that they're 1 through 12 because of other connections. So 5 over here, Hamsa. The color is conscious in there. It began as a orange, sienna, burnt sienna, cadmium, yellow deep. Deep, if you're a painter, you know these colors. Just the whole thing became that, and leaning more towards these sort of siennas and burnt siennas and browns and reddish browns. And at one point, I realized I had 2 tubes of this green, and with not knowing what was going to happen, I just made a couple of stripes across. And similar to avoiding imagery, I try to avoid aesthetic beauty, if that's weird to hear, but I tried not to make choices based on this is really beautiful to look at. So I just started covering it with that green and realized that brown underneath, the underpainting striking through, really activated that green on top. And where the green was thin, where the green was thick, I got less green and more green, and I got less depth and more depth. And I got this scrim. This felt like this scrim over the whole thing. So I don't know what your experience is in looking at it, but to me, I want to go past that green into that other space back there. And I'm not allowed to go in there. I can't go in there, but I know that there's another space back there, So, I mean, it's just on a technical level, it's just the process of underpainting and overpainting. If you're a painter, you know these things. But on a visual level, and then maybe on an emotional and meaning level, not trying to put meaning into it, but on a meaning level, there's this side and there's that side,
So what's so strange? The next thing I wanted to talk about anyways was about representation, because even you just talking about that painting, I see much more depth in the painting than when I was just glancing around the room and picking it as one pushing me out. And now I feel like I can fall into that painting from hearing you. One of the things that, just to bring this back to poetry briefly, is that a lot of even really avid readers in the United States are intimidated by poetry for some reason. And there are a lot of books written, like Why Poetry or How to Read Poetry. And a lot of it comes down to, I think, a category error about how you're supposed to engage with poetry versus a story. And that with poetry, like with music or with painting, you need to engage with it more than once. And one of the more satisfying things about sometimes when you're interviewing a poet is have them read a poem, discuss the poem, and then have them read the same poem again. Or else, like, I know Daniela Molnar somewhere here in the audience, like I went to one of her talks about her work, and her pigments are harvested from places of great meaning, whether a clear cut or a dying glacier or a concentration camp, making pigments from the materials there. And when she does a presentation, you've seen the paintings, you listen to the talk about the paintings and the meaning behind it, and then the paintings never look the same again. Yeah. And with you and I, you brought me to your studio. Mm-hmm. Then I saw them here at the opening with full of people. And then when everybody left, mm-hmm. 3 entirely different experiences. Mm-hmm. Linda and I were talking about how this empty room full of chairs made them look entirely different. Mm-hmm. So there's a particular aliveness to these canvases, mm-hmm. but you've done something more with representing them. Mm-hmm. And that's that people notice that some of them are alone and some of them are in pairs, which has a meaning, but also they've moved and they're going to move 3 times in the way that they've been ordered. So let's spend some time with like what it means to place them, mm-hmm. why they're placed together or separate, and then why they're also not in a static place on the walls.
Okay. Thank you for that softball. Appreciate that. When you see the paintings like this that we're habitually taught to think of as a diptych, this is a painting of 2 component parts. They're actually not diptychs, they're individual paintings that happen to be right up next to each other. So there's 12 individual paintings here. And if you came to the show prior to yesterday, it was not hung the way it is now. The structure of it was the same, where it was dot, dot, dash, dot, dot, dash, dot, dot, dash, in the Morse code language that spells the word victory, which is a really confusing word, message language, to send out. What does victory mean in this situation? But I wanted to have the arrangement, rather than be a static, this is what I want to say with this arrangement and say that word. I wanted them not to stay still at all, So yesterday, Daniel and Chris and Willie physically moved the paintings around so that none of the paintings is in its original location in the gallery as it was when we opened 2 weeks ago. None of the paintings that are next to each other are the same paintings that were next to each other 2 weeks ago. Things are forced to relate to each other. This pair is artificially forced to be next to each other. Same with that. Some that had the comfort of being paired are now sort of abandoned to themselves, have to be by themselves. I'm putting weird language on it, to direct the thinking. But the notion that there's not something certain, there's not something that we can think of as anything permanent. There's not something that you can rely on. And if you come back to the show after November 15th, this will be changed again. And it won't look the way it looks now. Mm. So take it in, drink it in, memorize it. And that same quality that I think exists in the paintings of not being able to find your footing and knowing that you can enter but not really knowing what you're entering with any kind of certainty, no hard ground to walk into, is the same quality with that uncertainty of coupling and abandonment, forced pairing. There's an uncertainty to that as well. And these choices weren't made based on aesthetic decisions, or theoretically, they're not based on aesthetic decisions. But we all are finding when we did this, when we laid it out the first time, when we made the changes on Friday, that of course aesthetics is always going to be part of what happens. Like those 2 paintings over there that are paired together. My brother Chad over here had the great suggestion of those going together, partly because of the way they look together, and as kind of crass as it sounds, you can't avoid it. We want to feel okay. We want to feel like things are normal. We want to feel like we can embrace something that makes us feel good. You know what I mean? So while the topic might be really hard to hold on to, and the notion even of tying beauty into that, beauty is going to insist that you also count me in. I want to be part of this too. I want us to find beauty too.
We've alluded a couple times to the number 12.
Yeah.
Should we talk about the number 12?
Let's go there.
Okay.
Yeah. So 12, at first it was a practical decision. I could do 6 at a time, so I can do another 6 at a time. And then it became really evident quickly that there's 12 months in the year. There's 12 hours of the day. There's 12 hours of the night. There's 12 constant, celestial shit. What do you call that? Astronomy, astrology. There's the 12 tribes of Israel. There's so much that the number can bring a way to start to think about why. Why this? Why this? It was not an intentional to start off with, but I embrace it. I embrace that number 12 for all of those reasons.
And when I heard you talking about the movement, it made me think also of maybe this is too reductive, but I'm curious about your thoughts about how most of the people in Gaza aren't from Gaza. They're actually displaced people from 1948 already. And now in the last 2 years are constantly being dispossessed within Gaza and moving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that constant movement of these is an attempt to kind of speak to that a little.
Would you say when you rearrange things that you were doing it more emotionally or visually?
But actually, the first arrangement and the second one, it was kind of done in tandem with other people's input. So it wasn't me saying this has to be this way. That's not going to be the case on the final one, but these first two. So some of it was like, oh, these two go well together, as mundane as that, and as sort of...
Well, visually or emotionally?
Visually, I think.
Okay.
I think visually, yeah. It's a very complex thing to show in a commercial gallery space work that has anything that goes beyond simply just visual allure. So I don't know if we want to get input from others that helped with the arrangement, but from my perspective, I was open to suggestion from the people I was working with yesterday, Daniel and Chad and others, like, how do these work together? The only thing I knew that I wanted to make sure was that the original arrangement, the ones that were coupled were no longer coupled. The ones that were diptychs were now singles somehow. The ones that were singles found partnership. That was the only sort of proviso that I had.
Thanks. Which 6 did you paint in the first batch? Which 6 are in the second batch? Did you paint them all at the same time or individually? And did you learn anything from the first 6 that informed the second 6?
At this point, I would say that they were painted simultaneously, all of them, with the exception of this one, which was completely painted all by itself without painting on others. But at this point, I can't identify numerically, even though they have numbers. Those numbers don't reflect this is the first painting, this is the second painting. That was an arbitrary choice. And my process always is to work on many, many things at the same time. And it's not different for these. So you might see paintings that contain a color in a painting, and then you see it show up in another painting because literally it was like, this painting is happening. Oh, I want to take some of this and put it over there too. They're all open until however it gets made the decision that I'm not doing anything else.
Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd love to reflect a little bit more on this idea of not letting the image through. And two of the things I was thinking about, you also used the word destruction. And one artist who came to mind is Gustav Metzger from the autodestructive art movement, and particularly his history series, where he uses very difficult images from the Second World War and blows them up to around the size of your paintings and covers them in blankets. And you have to lift the blanket and go underneath to experience the painting. And this is a kind of a way of, not letting the image through, but asking you to stay with it. And the other thing which kind of came to mind a lot when you were talking is just the word iconoclasm. And, thinking also about Judaism, thinking about what iconoclasm has meant in painting in relation to spirituality and religion, also in relation to Gaza. And, you use the word prayer in the in the text on this exhibition. So I'd love to hear a little bit more around that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This notion of a willingness to engage with the possibility of the meaning of work, I think resides with you. It's not me to impose on you. Similar to that, put the blanket on there and you have a choice. Do I engage? Yes, I'm going to choose to engage. I go in there. It's not that different from this. It's not that different from reading the title Parkland, Florida, and allowing yourself to make the connections and then go there. I don't think that it's the notion of prayer. I use the word prayer in writing that little thing on the card because, first of all, who here isn't a little bit suspect of the power of thoughts and prayers, as a solution to the things that we have to deal with, right? It seems like a very easy way to rescind responsibility or stop actual action. So prayer is a loaded word. I was raised in a religious environment. I was taught the power of prayer, and I don't really practice that at this point, but I recognize that the word itself is a really loaded word. In terms of the iconoclastic, I don't really know that connecting up the notion of a symbol is not anything I want to do. It's not an intentional thing, Allowing the possibility of assigning meaning to the choices that I made, you externally assigning meaning to the choices I made, I'm very happy to embrace that, Not necessarily agree with it, but want it to happen.
I'm wondering, now that you've gone this far into abstraction, if you're feeling a desire to stay at this level of abstraction, dive even deeper into it, or if you're feeling that next is a pulling back towards figuration. And then related to that, I feel like I personally, when I have a body of work, there's one piece that feels like it's going to be the bridge towards the next work. And I'm wondering if any of the pieces in here feel like they're the obvious, or not obvious, but that they will be an entry point into where you go next.
Not at all. Zero. And again, I think of everything as abstraction. So even though these are non-image based, I don't think they're any more abstract than the landscape paintings that people are familiar with seeing, or the portraits that I have made over the years, or any of it. It sounds a little spacious to say it that way, I know, because it's easy to quickly identify with imagery and stay there. But as the person making this stuff, that's not the first thing that I'm thinking about. And no, I have no idea what's coming next. So Daniel asked me that the other day. Said, what's the next? No idea.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that, actually. Yeah. The show is, of course, paired with a second room full of monotype prints, which do have some representation in them. Want to talk to that at all in relation to the last question?
Yeah, so those prints in the other room, obviously there's some imagery that does get read, landscape-based imagery, and I guess I should talk a little bit about an awakening of consciousness around the use of landscape imagery in general. For me, I first started making landscape paintings literally 45 years ago when I was living in Cyprus. I was fresh out of grad school. It would never have occurred to me to make a landscape painting because it was really not what was happening at the time, But knowing no witnesses, I didn't have any of my colleagues around to see to see that happening, and it was just so freaking beautiful to be in that space that I just started making landscape paintings. And there's something about it that really engaged not just an itch to paint, but also a way to create something that was a beautiful image that you could engage with. And it's only been in the last 10, 12 years or so that I've realized that I have avoided engaging with the exploitative nature of that, of taking imagery that is so beautiful to engage with, and you can just stay and live in that beauty, and to reconcile that with, as these prints are trying to do, reconcile that with the fact that all that beauty isn't really mine to take advantage of. We as a nation haven't reconciled the violence with which this nation was founded, the people who were pushed off the land, that the land was stolen from, that there hasn't been a reconciliation, and I'll admit it, I'm really sorry that it's taken me a long time to come to that, but I don't think it's ever too late to realize that, something has to shift here, obviously. So these paintings, these prints in here are collectively called Wild Beauty. Each of them has their own subtitle. And they are prints that I made based in response to images that were photographically made by photographers like Carlton Watkin and Curtis, and I forget his first name, and were part of an exhibition that Terry Totemeyer and John Larson put on at the Portland Art Museum in 2008 or 2009, maybe 2008, and they put out this beautiful catalog for it. And the photographs are photographs that are images of the Columbia Gorge from 1850-ish to 1950-ish, somewhere in there. And when Linda and I moved to California for a couple of years so that she could teach down at Mills College for a couple of years, I left behind everything up here. The only thing I took of my studio down there was my printing press and that catalog. And I made a whole bunch of prints based, in response to those images. And I was responding to them because they were just so beautiful. And they were so, just the organization of the composition of them, the structure of them. And nowhere in there was I also thinking about, wow, this is kind of fucked up. These images are of the spoils of war. And I'm enjoying that, So the exact same process of responding to those images, seeing the beauty in those images, recognizing the mastery of that work, honoring the first reason that exhibition was made, that Terry and John put that show together at the museum. But this time aware of the sort of questioning, who am I to do this? Who am I to take advantage of that and benefit from that? So, and then I talk about this, how do we now find that we can do this work and have it go out away from us, give back? How? I don't know, I haven't answered that yet. And it seems a weird sitting in the spaces around the walls of a commercial gallery. It's not the question that one would necessarily think you would be asking, but it is the question that I think that I'm starting to ask late to the game, and that I think a lot of us are maybe starting to realize that's a question we have to engage with. Kina, did you have a question?
I've been thinking a lot about you mentioned commercial gallery, and so I've been thinking quite a lot about this body of work, in part because you sent out some mailers with a kind of accordion landscape of the images that we could kind of shape in different hexagonal or pentagon or what have you, sort of loosely circular shapes. And so in that, as I've been sitting with the miniature versions for the past month or so, rearranging it, maybe every week, 2 weeks, different light, etc. And then being here a few weeks ago when they were first hung and seeing the arrangement today in a different configuration, I'm wondering for you, like with this body of work, is there a way in which, and I know we're doing a third iteration of switching them around, as you've seen them in miniature and in now 2 configurations here, if there's a way in which you have started to also envision them in a different sense or setting or landscape where they might have additional meaning or incongruities, etc.
I haven't spent a lot of time like really mulling that over in terms of what would be the ultimate setting, because honestly, well, first of all, addressing the fact that we are in a commercial space, I am asking my gallerists to find homes for these paintings. They are, in theory, not going to have the opportunity to be all together. You know, it's weird because you could say, like, you hope that they're never going to be all together, and, you know, because you need to make a living, but they also, you hope they get to stay together because as a group of paintings, there's a certain power that they hold as a group. So those are 2 fighting things. But a long time ago came to the realization that as these paintings go out into the world, into other people's lives, and are separated from one another, they are actually in diaspora. You know, that they will always be connected to one another, but they are out there. And that's not an unimportant metaphor, you know. So.
Hi. I guess I came to the show only knowing that it was going to be about Gaza and that there would be abstract paintings. So I walked in the gallery and I thought, oh, are these depictions in some sense of Gaza? And it was so interesting that in the beginning of the show to have that distinction of these aren't paintings of place, they're an emotional state. And there's been so much work about Gaza for good reason. But I think that this show is really, to me, speaking to me as like our souls, like our American souls have been totally vanquished and like run down. And that's something to pay attention to in the midst of a genocide that demands so much of our attention, but to acknowledge that our souls are just so run down. And what do we do with that? And I just wonder if in the process of creating these paintings, if you have any information that you received in that process for us about what to do with our very hurt souls.
God, I really wish I could answer that in the affirmative. I so desperately wish I could do that. Maybe what I could say to that is find your way to do that, you know, because to me, this is me finding my way to be able to somehow live with that. And that probably each of us has the ability to do that in whatever way that is. But the reality is it needs to happen. We need to engage. That's why it says on that placard, there's yesterday, there's tomorrow, but really there's today. Let's all be awake today. Let's figure this out today. Let's talk about this today. But yeah, there's a desperation and a sadness and a sorrow, but there's also a call to some kind of action.
On a really light note, as a family member, do you have any more paint left for your next project?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I can get back to work. Yeah.
Each work is kind of an unanswered question where you've gone into the other room, as you said, the extra space, and you've taken the hard way, which to me is reminiscent of alchemy. And you're looking for something, but you're not looking for the easy thing. You're not looking for the landscape. It got me to thinking about ghosts that are hidden and inherent inside of the work, as if they were a kind of unseen hologram and continue to be unseen, like the unanswered question. And yet, as I kept thinking, I realized that in a way, all of these are a lens that are focused into the room to possibly a singular ghost or hologram in the center. They can be arranged in any other way, but there's a sensibility rather than a view. Has that perception altered your point of view of helping us to see?
I'd have to say that I don't think I'm trying to help anybody to see.
Not even yourself?
I'm me, Honestly, I'm in the studio making the work is me and the work. I'm willing to share and feel free to try and have a conversation. You know what I mean? I'm trying to avoid the didactic potential that always exists when there's an image involved, right? So the image, I suspect, after the fact of the process of making, I suspect that impetus to completely get rid of imagery at every turn, and it was insistent. It was almost as if a hand was pushing my, don't do that, that there is a recognition that me telling you what to think or to come away with here is not the thing that needs to happen. Me making the work is the thing that needs to happen. You finding out why this work is moving you is your job. If it's moving you. If it's not moving you, then it's just, there you go.
I'm going to say a question of responsibility, the ability to respond to the material, to yourself, to the audience, to the world. And I'm at the moment thinking of, if I have a gun and I shoot it, I can say, I'm just shooting it off. Am I responsible? And I'm asking that question of you. You're not just shooting it off. You are responsible, I think. And that's why you're so intrigued by the work you've been evolving through, the hidden damage that comes out as a landscape. And here you've even gone into the landscape to where it seems to disappear.
See, I would take that gun, and instead of it being a gun, I would say you have a mirror. And if you hold up the mirror away from you, using your analogy, the responsibility is that reflection is somebody's going to have to engage with that. There's nothing inherently dangerous about that, but there is something potentially illuminating about that. The gun analogy to me is more, there's something inherently dangerous about it. And I don't think that there's anything inherently dangerous about asking a person to think about the reason these paintings were made or how they came to be,
I think about artists in America that view themselves as activists, like a form of activism, right, in making work. Responding to Vietnam War and that sort of thing. And here we are in Gaza, the situation in the Middle East, and with social media, right? We can keep reposting images of horror to remind each person, like, hey, this is happening, similarly to what happened in Parkland and that sort of thing. And then in 5 years, we'll be on to another horrific event, and so to speak. And so you being white, being far away from Gaza, and recognizing that position that you have, right? And making the work about it that somebody had said does not feel like Gaza at all, right? Because they're beautiful, they're colorful, they're not horrific, but your experience behind the canvas is horrific. And in terms of the wording and naming them in Arabic in that sort of way. And so I guess, and I don't know how to ask this question, and I don't know, you recognize the structure that you find the work in. Where does it find yourself outside of the canvas, outside of the art world, right? Like your position in recognizing this horror, being an American citizen, I being an American citizen, paying our taxes and that sort of thing. What would you like to see outside of the canvas for yourself, and helping us understand the work that you make that is in response to the horrors that happen within the United States and outside of the United States?
Well, that's a huge question, and I only come to this as a painter. I'm not a pundit or whatever. I don't know that I would call myself an activist, even though I might have to consider that. My wife and I talk about this a lot, about the need to really decolonize ourselves, those of us who have the kind of power and privilege that comes with a face that looks like this and a room that looks like this, and are trying to figure out how to do that. That's the best I can do right now. I don't know the answer, but I do know that awareness is burgeoning. So, and it will take that kind of awareness for answers to actually come. If you're not aware, if you just go through the world unaware, as I, with landscape painting, did for 30 years, 35 years, you can just take comfort in the fact that you're making something really beautiful and people are living with something really beautiful if they own it. But after that, then how do you then turn that into something that is helpful beyond just a little reprieve from ugliness, I wish I could answer that more deeply.
I think that's most of the questions, but I'm going to give this back to David in case there's something has come up in that. And then if not, we'll just call it good.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. And I encourage people to come back when the work gets re-presented. What's the date?
Well, November 15th is the day. It might happen on the 14th. I'm not sure. We'll figure it out. But right around then is when it's going to change.
Thank you. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Stephen Hayes' work at stephenhayes.net and at elizabethleach.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider transforming yourself from a listener to a listener supporter by joining the Between the Covers community. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives the supplementary resources with each conversation of things I discovered while preparing for the conversation, things referenced during it, and places to explore once you're done listening. And then you can choose from a variety of other things as well, including the bonus audio archive with a wide variety of contributions from past guests, whether Alice Oswald reading a ballad to Anne Carson, Jen Bervin reading the letters of Paul Celan, Roger Reeves reading Hassan Kanafani, Omar El Akkad reading Jory Graham, and much more. There's also the Tin House Early Reader subscription, receiving 12 books over the course of the year, months before they're available to the general public, among many other things. You can check it all out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elisa Ogie in the book division, Becky Kramer in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, performer, and much more, Alicia Jo Rabins, for making the intro and outro for the show. You can find out more about her work, her writing, her music, her film, and her teaching at aliciajo.com, ALICIAJO.com.